Yeah, by the way, this is what a number 8 piston looks like when you get a bad tune. Yeah, it was stock, no, not even a CAI, nothing. And that's not normal. While you guys are disassembling your engine, you should make notes. Anything you get back from the machinist, any information you get on SVT or any other website, YouTube, any questions that you have to ask, any sequences and protocols and rules that need to take place for the engine build, for reassembly. You should make notes of it. I took pictures of everything as I was disassembling it. You know, it looks like a big mess down here on my cart, but actually everything is organized in their own Ziploc bag, labeled. It may be fresh in your mind when you're disassembling an engine, but you let a week or 3 or 4 go by and go to reassemble, and you're going to be in a situation because you're not going to remember. Anyway, here's the block. Tim has torqued down the main studs, measured and installed the main bearings. This makes my job easy. Really all I have to do is keep it clean, keep all foreign material out of it, use some assembly lube, Max Tough, a royal purple brand assembly lube. So I'm going to take the crank out here in a little bit once I take these main caps off and bearings out, and we'll start assembling the short block. Alright, I've removed the main caps and the upper bearing. Actually, it would be the lower bearing. Stacked them here in order, in which direction they face. You don't want to get those backwards. I don't want to. I've wiped down the threads and the ARP bolts, even though they had been torqued down before. I don't want any foreign material in my engine at all. And I've been having some bad luck, so I don't want to take any chances. The ARP studs that come with this, it shows you the sequence. You can see it right here. A lot of you already know this sequence, but it shows you which bolts to torque down, in what sequence, and in what foot-pounds, while you're doing it. So, it starts out with you tighten studs 1 through 20, starting at 1, which is one of the outer main studs, and then 2, which is also the outer main stud, and then you follow the sequence 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then you get to the inner main studs, the larger ones, and you torque those down. It says to torque them down, the studs 1 through 20 at 20 foot-pounds. Then you go back and you repeat the process to 1 through 20 at 45 pounds. And then finally you tighten the inner studs, the ones in the center, the larger studs. You tighten those 11 through 20 at 80 foot-pounds, leaving the outer, smaller ARP studs at 45 pounds. Finally, you tighten the side bolts last, after all the main cap main studs are torqued down. And you tighten the oil pickup tube bolt at 20 foot-pounds. It's the one with the little extra stud sticking up there. Alright, all this has been wiped down with acetone. I blew it out first. There wasn't really anything in there, but it doesn't hurt to do it once again. Everything, like I said, it's been deburred, but I blew air through every port, everything that I could find that's going to may have some metallic flake or material in there that as soon as the oil pump is primed and pushes the oil into your main bearing, the last thing you want is for it to push a piece of crap in there, and there you are. I'm not saying it would blow your engine up. It may, but I'd rather get 100,000 or more out of my engine than 50,000. After I take the crank out of its bag and wipe it down with acetone, make sure it's 100% clean. Put the assembly lube, install the crank, install the caps, and do the torque sequence. And then after that, we'll turn it over, clean the cylinders, and wipe them down. Make sure there's no foreign material in there. Wipe them down with some WD-40. Okay, I've applied some assembly lube to the main bearings. I've taken the crank out and I've cleaned it with acetone. So I'm going to finish putting a little bit of assembly lube into the center of these main caps, main bearings. And I'm going to set the crank in, and then we're going to put the caps on and torque them down. Alright, there's the crank installed, main bearings, assembly lube, thrust bearing, thrust washer. Everything looks good. I don't see any foreign material in here, which I feel really good about. And I actually did clean this off a little better where the oil pan goes, because I don't want any oil leaking. And then, alright, I've taken the nuts, the ARP nuts and washers for these studs, and I've sprayed them down and cleaned them real good with brake clean. If they're new, they don't have to be, but these were pre-assembled at MPR, the way it should be, torqued down prior to installing the crank. So they did have some ARP assembly lube on it. I want to get that off of there so I can reapply the ARP fastener assembly lube that comes with the ARP studs. I have some assembly lube. It's come out of these chamfered oil port on the journal here on the pin for the rods. I'm just going to wipe that off. The reason why is because if there is any dust or anything, I don't want it to settle on there. I know I keep stressing about the foreign material, and if you guys are planning on using rags instead of lint-free cloth or some of the microfiber window cleaning towels, if you use anything other than that, then I spent too much money, time, blood, sweat, and tears, and I've got too much loss already. I don't need any more. So, alright, so I'm going to start installing these washers and nuts with the ARP lube, get them hand tight, and then we'll go through the sequence. Alright, I've got the caps on, the ARP nuts and washers lubed and hand tight, but I'm waiting on my girlfriend to bring back the torque wrench. In the meantime, I was going to cover a couple things that you need to let your machinist know or make sure that they're doing. If you get APR down here in Florida, you don't have to worry about it. I'm sure there's a lot of other ones you do not have to worry about. It just happens to be the only one in Florida that I found that's reputable. But if they, overall checking your block, there's most of you know it, it's called line bore. This didn't have to do it, everything was lined up, but they go through your main here to your second web, third, fourth, fifth, and make sure that it's straight. If they have to line bore it, you want to wait to order your main bearings to be sized with the line bore that they put in there. In most cases, and hopefully that won't have to be done. But the deck on here, to make sure it's square and flat. If there's any low spots, high spots, scratches, dents, whatever, it's going to play havoc down the road with your head gasket. This is really smooth and like glass, which is what I understand the MHL type gaskets for these engines prefer, opposed to the old cast iron blocks that were a little rough and to get grip, or whatever you want to call it, on the gaskets. The bore, everybody knows, torque plate hone and bore the cylinders, and unlike the Chevy shop I went to that was going to just bore them 20 over and then let me buy pistons to put in there. So somebody that says that or thinks that they can do it that way is probably smoking crack. On these engines, they just are probably just unaware, like the other guy. But I seen at Tim's shop where he had it bored. I can't remember if it was, I think it was 10 over, and he had the pistons for it, but still had to hone, bore, hone a very small fraction to actually have optimal cylinder size for the piston, because that's what you want on these engines. Is what I've learned, is that you don't want just in range cylinder to piston wall clearance. You want optimal. I get them to check all the core plugs and threaded plugs, freeze plugs that are in your block, and make sure that they're good. You want them to check the crank. On the crank itself, you have the mains and you have the pins. And of course, the mains are what the main bearings ride on, and the cap bolts over on top of. And then your pins is what your rods ride on. You want to get that checked for roundness. Each one, not just the pins, but the mains also. The more I've learned about these engines, the more I learn that perfection in the machine work is what's going to, and then mocking that up for you makes your assembly easier, and you're going to have longevity. You'll have a good engine. I know that when they torque down the ARP studs and bolts, ARP studs and nuts onto the cap, onto the main with the bearings in it. Of course, you want to measure your bearings, and when they torque this down on there, they check for squareness of the block in general, to make sure that the block's not contorted, it's not twisted. If you got a block from somewhere else, sometimes you don't know where it came from. You don't know what was done to the block, what was blown through it, what horsepower it was producing, and if it got twisted and contorted. I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but I wanted to, the oil pump, when you have that off, I broke the torque head screws loose. Replace the new one. I'd probably advise, or at least I'm going to, there's oil in here, old oil, clean it with brake clean, and oil this new gear. Install it, put it back on. Crankshaft in play. That's the lateral movement of the crankshaft from front to back. In play for the Coyote 5.0 is 0.003 through 0.015. You know, I've got this. I've had this for my dirt bikes and ATVs, and I kind of just it's not actually intended to screw in here to the end of the crankshaft, but it's stable, sturdy, and so on these main caps, when you put these main caps down, check to see if you actually can look in the holes, or actually at the top of the stud, and look down, and you can see if there's an even space gap around the stud. If it's pushed all over to one side, if it's hanging over on one side versus the other, you can, before you tighten any of the nuts, check that. Alright, I'm going to torque these main ARP nuts on their studs per the bolt torque sequence of the ARP instructions. We've got one on the outside of the caps, main caps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 at 20 pounds, and then we'll move to the larger ARP studs on the main caps. Alright, that's the outer nuts, torqued to 20 pounds. I'm going to put one mark on each one of these top of these ARP studs. The reason why, and a lot of people have done this before, I've just learned it from paying attention, listening, watching, that those are now torqued one time to 20 pounds, one mark. When I come back and torque it to 45, I'll put another mark across the other way, exit out, I'll know it's done. I'm only torquing it to 20 pounds, but once I get to torquing them 45, once I get this 45, 45, and I come back and get this 45 and 45, I'll turn the crank and then move to the next cap, turn the crank when it's done, move to the next cap, torque it, turn the crank. I just want to always know that it's turning freely after every torque of every cap, so that if something is binding or holding it up, which in this case, in this motor, it's just not going to happen. But if it does, if it did, I would know where it's at. Alright, well, I'm going to finish torquing this. Alright, everything's torqued. And the side bolts, those are at 45 pounds. Feels good. So next I'm going to start, let's see, rod bearings, pistons, rings. So I guess the first thing to do would be to file the rings. I'll put the rings in the piston, in the cylinders. Push them in there, and with a feeler gauge measure the gap. So I'm going to shut this off, put this camera on the stand, and I'm going to try to check and see what we have for in play. If you don't have in play, you could have meltdown. So, but I've seen on YouTube where you can search in play or set in play on crank in play, and I've watched a few of those videos, so they can explain better what in play is, why it's important, how too much in play is bad, why it's bad, all that stuff, how the harmonic balancer comes into play. So if I push the crank, let's see, all the way forward, I'm just sticking it between the pin journal, the rod journal, and the cap. Alright, that's set on 0 on the gauge, on the dial gauge. I push the crank back. We push the crank all the way forward, set at 0, and then all the way back we have 0.0075. So that's better. That's as much crank in play as this engine has, and it's accurate because this thrust bearing and thrust spacer, the crank is bottoming out on those at the same time when the crank is pushed forward. So now you can get as much space, as much in play as possible when you push the crank back. I know there's a lot of talking and explaining, but these are things that I'm going to be happy about once I get this engine together. I'm going to feel confident that everything's right. It's got an arrow pointing to the front. Let's see the rings. You got the top groove, the second groove. You got the bottom groove, which is the oil retention rings. I know that the second groove rings have a dot on the ring itself, which Manley says that faces up on the piston. I don't know if you can see the dot. Really can't see nothing this morning. What's going on here? Anyway, so firing order, no, not firing order, but the got one. This is the front of the block. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, number 8. Infamous number 8. Alright. I'm going to take these rings, and what we'll do is, what I'll do, so we'll start with the number 1 piston, the number 1 cylinder anyway, and we'll install the rings down. They say to go in about, I think it's about an inch. I'll read the paper again. We'll take a piston, the top of a piston, push that ring down to where it's in the cylinder like this, and then we can measure the gap, and we can file it until we get it to exactly what we want. You guys are going to laugh at this. I didn't have a ring file, so I made one. Engineered a disc in there. Squared this up with the bolts that I put in here, the screws that I put in here, so that this can set level, straight, and square. When you file this, oh man, let's see, the wheel turns this way, so you want to file to the inside of the ring, not to the outside of the ring. Alright, so when I file that, I'm going to file on one side of the ring, not squeezing this ring to file on both sides of the ring. The reason why is because we know that this side is flat and square, so if we file just the one side, then we can hold it up to the light once we have filed some off of it. Squeeze the ring together to make sure that it's still you know, that it's still square, it's still straight. Yeah, so it's gonna work, man. Alright, put the ring in here. Take the feeler gauge. What we're looking for on this one is 0.018. So 0.018. It's pretty tight. 19 doesn't fit. Right. No. Alright. On these rings, the second ring has a dot on it, which Manly says that, you know, the dot is up. This one didn't have a dot on it. It's got a beveled edge, but it's really slightly beveled. You can hardly tell. So I found the beveled edge, and I put a Sharpie mark on the ring just for me, just so I'll know that that's up. So this ring is done. It's the top ring for the number 1 piston. Okay, I filed 1, 2, 3, and 4, the first and the second ring. Once you file them, definitely check for the burrs on the sides, on all 4 sides of the ring. So I've got these 4 precise, and when you hold them up to the light, it seals. Well, I say seal, the ends meet exactly on the tops and the bottoms when you touch them together. The second ring is made of a different, I think it's cast, some different metal. The top rings on Manly's anyway are harder than the bottom. I destroyed one ring, the second one. Not the top ring, but the second ring. Because when I started on the second ones, I put it in the file, and man, it just ground a lot more off faster than these. So that was my learning experience on that. So I'm short 1 second ring. I'll have to probably buy a new set, but it's a expensive lesson for an even more valuable, expensive price for an even more valuable lesson. So I'm going to get the rest of these filed, and then start putting the rings on the pistons. Actually putting the pistons on the rods with the wrist pins and the circlips, and installing the rings on the pistons, and then eventually into the block on the crank.